The chandelier light in the private alcove of the Crystal Lotus wasn't just illumination. It was a spotlight on a world Han Seok-Jin had long ago decided was a theater of lies. Across from him, Isabella Moreau adjusted her red off-shoulder dress, her movements a calculated dance of high-status femininity. She was talking, something about the merger between their families or a gala in Paris, but her voice was merely background noise to Seok-Jin. He sat with a posture of modern dominance, his black tailored suit blending into the shadows of the booth, the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck a silent warning to anyone who dared mistake his silence for weakness. He had rejected every woman his mother had placed in this chair, models, heiresses, and CEOs, because they all looked at him and saw a throne, not a man. Then, the air in the room seemed to shift. A shadow fell across the table, followed by a voice that didn't carry the practiced lilt of the elite. "Good evening. May I present your menus?" Seok-Jin's eyes, usually as cold and impenetrable as a winter sea, locked onto the woman standing beside him. Zara Nwoye leaned forward with an attentive, professional grace, her radiant, dark skin glowing against the crisp white of her waitress apron. But it wasn't just her elegance that stopped the breath in his chest. It was her smile. It was genuine, warm, and entirely unaware of the tectonic plate of his world shifting beneath his feet. Isabella continued to smile at him, radiant and polished, but she had become a ghost in the room. Seok-Jin didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at his date. He looked at the waitress with a focused intensity that decided everything in a heartbeat. In a city where he held all the power, he realized with terrifying clarity that he had finally found the one thing he couldn't control. Before we continue, if this story already has you hooked, take a second to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning sunlight in Seoul didn't just enter the boardroom of Seok-Jin's family conglomerate. It seemed to wait for his permission. Seok-Jin sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silence a heavy, tangible thing that made the executive team breathe a little shallower. Before him lay the quarterly reports of an empire that spanned shipping, tech, and the darker, unrecorded shadows of the city. He managed it all with a surgical, cold precision, moving assets like chess pieces. To the world, he was a king in a tailored suit, but as the meeting adjourned and the heavy doors clicked shut, the true weight of his crown began to press down. His mother, Madame Park, did not knock. She entered with the soft rustle of silk and the sharp click of heels that signaled an authority even Seok-Jin couldn't ignore. She bypassed the leather chairs and walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city her husband had helped build and her son now ruled. "The Moreau girl called her mother in tears last night, Seok-Jin," she began, her back to him. Her voice was calm, but it carried the edge of a blade. "She said you looked at her as if she were a ghost, or worse, a nuisance." Seok-Jin didn't look up from his tablet. "She was talking about the guest list for a gala that hasn't been scheduled yet. She is a ghost, mother. A ghost of a life I have no interest in living." Madame Park turned, her eyes narrowed. She didn't care about the billions he had added to the family coffers this year. She cared about the legacy that was stalled in his veins. "You are 32. Your father was already holding you by this age. The company needs stability, and stability comes from a bloodline. I do not need a CEO who can triple our exports. I need a son who can provide a grandson before I am too old to teach him how to hold his head up." "I am not a breeding horse for the family name," Seok-Jin said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "Then stop acting like a machine," she snapped back. "Every woman I find for you is empty or boring or calculating. Isabella is the daughter of my oldest friend. She is refined. She is elite. She is what a man of your stature requires." Seok-Jin stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished floor. He thought of the restaurant, the smell of expensive perfume clashing with the sterile air of the boardroom, and then, unbidden, the memory of a genuine, warm smile and the sight of a woman who looked at him without a single calculation in her eyes. "I have done everything for this company," Seok-Jin said, walking toward the door. "I have bled for it. I have stayed awake in the dark for it. But my heart is not a company asset, Mother. You cannot audit it, and you certainly cannot tell me who is allowed to enter it." As he walked out, the silence of the hallway felt louder than her protests. He didn't head for his next meeting. Instead, he signaled for his driver. He needed to go back to the only place where the air felt real. The Crystal Lotus was a sanctuary of hushed whispers and clinking silver, a place where the air always smelled of expensive jasmine and old money. Zara moved through the dining room with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her white apron a sharp contrast against her black dress. To the patrons, she was a ghost of service, someone who anticipated a need before it was spoken. But tonight, for the first time in her career, she felt a gaze so heavy it was as if someone had reached out and touched her shoulder. At table 7, the man in the black suit was a pillar of cold marble. His date, a woman in a striking red dress that screamed of effort and expectation, was laughing at something he hadn't even acknowledged. Zara approached them, her menu book held with professional poise, and offered her most genuine, warm smile. It was the only armor she had in a room full of people who looked through her. When she caught Han Seok-Jin's eyes, the air between them seemed to vibrate. His stare was locked, calm, and utterly focused, ignoring the beautiful woman beside him as if she were a mere shadow in the booth. "May I get you started with some sparkling water?" Zara asked, her voice steady despite the strange heat crawling up her neck. Seok-Jin didn't blink. "Yes," he said, the word more a command than a request. As Zara turned to attend to another table, she could feel his eyes following the sway of her movement, cataloging the way she spoke to other customers with that same, unhurried kindness. She focused on her tasks, refilling glasses and clearing plates, but every time she passed table 7, the intensity of the man's focus remained unchanged. He wasn't eating, he was watching. When the bill was settled, and Isabella rose to head toward the entrance, Seok-Jin did something that deviated from the script of a perfect date. He excused himself with a short, authoritative word, watching Isabella walk toward the foyer before he pivoted. He didn't head for the restroom. Instead, he moved toward the mahogany podium where the restaurant manager stood, his presence commanding an immediate, nervous bow from the staff. "Mr. Han," the manager whispered, his hands clasped tightly. "Was the service not to your satisfaction? We can." "The waitress," Seok-Jin interrupted, his voice a low vibration that brooked no delay. "The one with the smile, Zara." The manager glanced toward the kitchen where Zara was just disappearing. "Ah, Zara Nwoye. She is one of our best, sir. Very efficient." "Is she married?" The question was so direct it left the manager blinking in surprise. I don't believe so, Mr. Han. She is very private. I don't know if there is a man in her life, but she has never mentioned one." Seok-Jin nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He didn't offer an explanation, and he didn't need to. He reached into his jacket, producing a card that he didn't hand over, instead simply tapping it against the wood of the podium as if marking a territory. "Thank you for your time," he said, the ice in his voice replaced by a strange, newfound purpose. He turned and walked away, his stride relaxed but commanding, leaving the manager staring after him. Outside, the city lights awaited him, but as he stepped into his car, Seok-Jin was already counting the hours until he could return to the only table that mattered. And if you're enjoying this story so far, please make sure you like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and there's a lot more coming. For 3 days, the memory of the Crystal Lotus lingered in Seok-Jin's mind like a persistent fever. He found himself dismissing meetings early and staring at the rain-streaked windows of his office, his thoughts tracing the curve of a smile that hadn't been bought with family influence or corporate ties. On the 3rd evening, he didn't call for the usual security detail. He drove himself, the hum of the engine a lonely vibration in the quiet streets of Seoul, until the familiar gold-leafed sign of the restaurant appeared through the mist. He entered alone this time, his presence still commanding enough to make the host stumble over a greeting. He didn't want the private alcove. He sat at a small, exposed table in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the floor until they found her. Zara was moving between tables, a stack of menus tucked under one arm, her expression a mask of professional grace. When she noticed him, her pace faltered for only a fraction of a second before she adjusted her posture and approached. "Welcome back, sir," she said, her voice warm but guarded. "A table for one tonight." "I'm not here for the food, Zara," Seok-Jin said. His voice was lower than usual, a private frequency intended only for her. He watched the way her name sounded on his tongue, noticing the subtle rise of her shoulders as she processed his directness. Zara hesitated, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the leather of the menu. "The manager mentioned you had questions the other night. Is everything all right with your service?" "Everything is perfect," he replied, his gaze locked on hers with the same intensity that had unnerved Isabella 3 days prior. "But I haven't been able to think about anything else since I left this building. I came back because of you. I felt a pull, something I can't explain." For a moment, the restaurant seemed to go silent. Zara looked at him, her bright, expressive eyes searching his stoic face for a sign of a punchline. Then, to his surprise, she let out a soft, melodic laugh, a sound that was entirely too bright for the heavy atmosphere he had created. "You are very talented at this, Mr. Han," she said, shaking her head as she tucked a loose curl behind her ear. Seok-Jin frowned slightly, his brows knitting together. "Talented at what?" "At the games," she said, her smile turning slightly mischievous but remaining polite. "You came here 3 days ago with your beautiful wife in that stunning red dress. You looked like the most powerful couple in the city. And now, you're back here, telling the waitress you can't stop thinking about her. It's a very bold script, sir, but I've seen enough movies to know how it ends." "She wasn't my wife," Seok-Jin said, the words coming out sharper than intended. "It was a date, a business arrangement, nothing more." Zara's laugh faded into a look of gentle skepticism. She leaned forward slightly, her posture attentive yet firm. "Whether she's a wife or a date, a man like you doesn't belong in a place like this talking to a woman like me. You have a world of gold and glass, Mr. Han. Don't play games with someone who spends her day carrying the glass for you." "It isn't a game," he insisted, reaching out as if to touch her hand before drawing back, remembering the eyes of the room. "Give me a chance to prove it. Exchange contacts with me. Let me speak to you when I'm not Mr. Han and you aren't the waitress." Zara looked at him for a long beat, seeing the desperate sincerity beneath the Mafia boss's armor. She sighed, a small smile returning to her face. "You're very persistent, but I don't give my number to men who are supposedly on dates with other women. Enjoy your dinner, sir. It's on the house tonight." She turned away before he could answer, leaving Seok-Jin sitting in the middle of the crowded room, a man who could buy the building but couldn't buy a single minute of her time. The following weeks became a silent ritual that the staff of the Crystal Lotus began to time their shifts by. Every Tuesday and Thursday, at exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy glass doors would swing open to admit Han Seok-Jin. He no longer arrived with high society dates or business associates. He came alone, choosing the same central table that left him exposed and vulnerable to the gaze of every patron in the room. He didn't bring a laptop or a stack of files. He simply brought himself, sitting with a quiet, patient stillness that stood in stark contrast to his reputation as a man who tore through the city like a winter storm. Zara tried to maintain her professional distance, but it was becoming impossible to ignore the way the air seemed to settle whenever he was near. Each time she approached his table, he didn't ask for expensive vintages or off-menu delicacies. He asked her about her day, about the music she liked, and about the stories her parents told her back in Lagos. He listened with an intensity that made Zara feel as if her words were the most valuable assets he had ever acquired. "You're still here," she noted one rainy Tuesday, pouring him a fresh glass of tea. "The manager says you've turned down 3 invitations to the Blue House this week just to sit in this drafty dining room." Seok-Jin looked at her, the usual stoicism in his eyes softening into something that resembled peace. "The Blue House is full of people who want something from me, Zara. Here, I'm just a man waiting for a woman with a genuine smile to notice that I'm not playing a game." Zara paused, the teapot hovering over the porcelain cup. For the first time, she didn't laugh. She saw the fatigue in the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion of a man who managed a legacy he hadn't asked for and a family company that viewed him as a machine. She realized that beneath the tailored suit and the dark tattoo on his neck, Seok-Jin was desperately lonely. He wasn't looking for a trophy or a secret. He was looking for a witness to his own humanity. They began to share fragments of their lives in the brief intervals between her duties. He told her about the pressure of his mother's expectations and the silence of his father's empty office. She told him about the vibrant colors of Nigeria and the struggle of moving to a city that often saw her as an outsider. The Mafia Boss and the Waitress began to dissolve, replaced by two people finding common ground in the middle of a crowded room. By the third week, the skepticism that had shielded Zara's heart began to melt. She saw him help an elderly couple with their coats when the host was busy. She saw the way he treated her with a consistent, unwavering respect that had nothing to do with her status. One evening, as the restaurant began to empty, she finally stayed at his table a moment longer than necessary. "My shift ends at 10, she said, her voice a soft confession. "If you're still outside, maybe we can talk somewhere that doesn't require a menu." Seok-Jin didn't smile, but the look of relief that washed over his face was more beautiful than any expression Zara had ever seen. He nodded once, a gesture of profound gratitude. "I'll be the one waiting this time," he promised. The Seok-Jin family estate was a monument to traditional power, a place where the scent of aged cedar and expensive incense hung heavy in the air. As Seok-Jin walked through the courtyard, his reflection caught in the dark, still water of the koi pond, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in his 32 years, he wasn't entering this house to give a report or seek approval. He was entering to claim his life. He found his mother, Madame Park, in the tea room. She was dressed in a slate-gray hanbok that made her look like a statue carved from moonlight. When she saw him, her face softened into a rare, genuine smile. She gestured to the cushion across from her, already pouring a cup of dark, fragrant tea. "You look different, Seok-Jin. There is a light in your eyes I haven't seen since you were a boy. Tell me the Moreau family has finally forgiven your silence." Seok-Jin sat, but he didn't touch the tea. He watched the steam rise, thinking of the way Zara's laughter sounded against the backdrop of the city's roar. "I didn't come to talk about Isabella, Mother. I came to tell you that I've found her, the one I want to marry, the one who will carry this family's future." Madame Park let out a soft, delighted breath, her hands folding over her heart. "Oh, Seok-Jin, finally, I knew you would see reason. Is it the daughter of Chairman Lee? Or perhaps the young woman who just returned from the London School of Economics? No matter if you have chosen her, she must be exceptional. Tell me her name. Tell me who has finally captured the heart of my son." Seok-Jin looked his mother directly in the eyes, his voice steady and devoid of the coldness that usually defined their conversations. "Her name is Zara Nwoye." The silence that followed was so absolute it felt physical. The smile on Madame Park's face didn't fade all at once. It withered, the joy turning into a brittle, confused mask. "Zara Nwoye," she repeated, the name sounding foreign and jagged in the refined air of the tea room. "I do not know this family. Which conglomerate do they lead? Is she from the textile Nwoyes? I haven't heard of them in Seoul." "She isn't from a conglomerate, Mother," Seok-Jin said, his posture remaining upright and commanding. "She is from Lagos. And she is a waitress at the Crystal Lotus. She is the most striking, honest woman I have ever met." The teacup in Madame Park's hand hit the saucer with a sharp, metallic clatter. The warmth in the room vanished, replaced by an ice so profound it seemed to frost the windows. She stood up, her gray silk rustling like dead leaves. "A waitress!" Her voice was a low, vibrating hiss. "You come into this house, the house of your father, and tell me you wish to bring a servant into our bloodline, a girl who carries plates for a living." "She is not a servant. She is the woman I love," Seok-Jin replied, standing to meet her gaze. "You have been blinded by a pretty face and a clever act," his mother snapped, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venom. "She is a nobody, a girl from nowhere who saw a rich man and played her part. You will not mention this name again, Seok-Jin. This is not a romance, it is a lapse in judgment. I will call Isabella's mother tomorrow." "You won't call anyone," Seok-Jin said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet frequency that made men in boardrooms tremble. "Because if Zara Nwoye is not welcome in this family, then you no longer have a son to lead it." Madame Park stared at him, her face a mask of shock and burgeoning rage, as the shadow of his ultimatum fell across the room. The drive to the Seok-Jin estate was a blur of high-rise glass and narrowing traditional streets, a transition from the modern pulse of Seoul to the silent, ancient weight of his family's history. Zara sat in the back of the black sedan, her fingers interlaced tightly in her lap. She had traded her waitress apron for a modest but elegant silk dress the color of deep earth, her hair pulled back into a sleek, professional ponytail. Seok-Jin reached over, his large hand covering hers, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles in a silent promise. He didn't need to speak. The steady heat of his touch told her that he was her shield. When they entered the grand dining hall, the air felt thin, stripped of all warmth by the woman waiting at the head of the table. Madame Park sat with a posture that was a masterclass in aristocratic disdain. As Zara approached, offering her most genuine, warm smile, the same smile that had dismantled Seok-Jin's defenses weeks ago, it met a wall of absolute, cold anger. Madame Park didn't rise. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply looked at Zara, as if she were a smudge of dirt on an otherwise perfect porcelain plate. "So," Madame Park began, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor through silk, "this is the woman who has caused my son to forget his duty. Tell me, Zara, is the service industry truly so difficult that you felt the need to hunt for a permanent retirement in my son's bank account?" Zara's smile faltered, but her eyes remained bright and expressive, refusing to cast downward. "I am here because Seok-Jin asked me to be, madam, and I am here because I care for him, not for what he manages." "A lovely script," the matriarch replied, picking up her chopsticks with clinical precision. "But we are not in your restaurant now. There is no need to perform. How much are your parents struggling in Lagos? Did they send you here with the specific instruction to find a man who doesn't know the value of his own inheritance?" The insult to her family hit Zara harder than the personal slight. She felt the warmth drain from her face, replaced by a quiet, vibrating power. Seok-Jin's grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles turned white, the tattoo on his neck appearing darker against his tensed skin. "Mother, that is enough," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "It is never enough when a gold digger enters my home," Madame Park snapped, finally looking at her son. "She is a waitress, Seok-Jin. She sees a mountain of gold and she starts climbing. Do you really think she would look at you twice if you were the man clearing the tables instead of the one owning them?" Zara stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. The effortless grace the manager had once praised was now a weapon of dignity. "I have worked for everything I have, Madame Park. I know the value of a hard day's work, which is perhaps why I can see the man beneath the suit while you only see a title. I didn't come here for your gold. I came here for him." "Then leave the same way you came," Madame Park said, gesturing to the door without looking up. "With nothing." The dinner ended not with a resolution, but with a standoff that shook the very foundations of the house. Zara walked out into the cool night air, her heart heavy with disappointment, but as Seok-Jin followed her, his eyes were locked on her with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that proved the matriarch had already lost. The drive back to the city was filled with a thick, suffocating silence, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the quiet before a landslide. Seok-Jin gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set in a line of iron, while Zara stared out at the passing neon lights of Seoul. He could feel her hurt, not because she had been rejected, but because she had seen the ugliness of a family that valued gold over heartbeat. He didn't take her back to the restaurant or her small apartment. He took her to his private penthouse, a glass fortress that overlooked the empire he was currently prepared to burn down. After ensuring Zara was settled, Seok-Jin didn't sleep. He waited for the sun to crest over the Han River before he drove back to the family estate. He didn't wait for breakfast to be served. He walked directly into his mother's private study, the heels of his boots echoing against the polished wood like a countdown. Madame Park was already there, composed and regal, sipping tea as if she hadn't dismantled her son's happiness only hours before. "I assume you've come to apologize for that girl's behavior," she said without looking up, her voice cool and dismissive. "I've come to give you a choice, Mother," Seok-Jin replied. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, a man who had finally realized that the walls of his office were just a larger version of a cage. "I have spent my entire life being the son you wanted. I have managed this company, protected this name, and rejected my own desires to satisfy your vanity. But that ended last night." Madame Park set her cup down, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp interest. Do not be dramatic, Seok-Jin. You are a man of logic. Logic says you marry into your own class. Logic says you protect the bloodline. Logic says that a man who has nothing to lose is the most dangerous person in the room, Seok-Jin countered, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. So here is my logic. I love Zara Nwoye. I am going to marry her. She's going to be the woman by my side when I lead this company, and she is the only woman who will ever give you the grandchildren you claim to crave. He stepped closer, leaning over the desk until he was in her personal space, the dark tattoo on his neck pulsing with the rhythm of his conviction. If she isn't your daughter-in-law, I am no longer your son. I will walk out of the headquarters this morning. I will resign from every board, withdraw every personal asset, and leave the Seok-Jin name to rot in the hands of the cousins you despise. You can have your precious status, mother, but you will have it in an empty house. Madame Park's face paled, the first crack appearing in her marble facade. She looked at him and realized for the first time that she had no leverage. He wasn't bluffing. He was a man who had found something more valuable than a conglomerate, and he was willing to trade the world for it. You would throw away 5 generations of work for a waitress, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. I would throw it away for the only person who sees me as a man instead of a transaction, Seok-Jin said, turning toward the door. You have until the market opens to decide if you want a legacy or a lonely grave. The following 3 days were the quietest the Seok-Jin estate had ever known, a chilling stillness that felt more like a burial than a standoff. Seok-Jin had not returned to the office, and the family company's stock began to flicker like a dying candle as rumors of a leadership vacuum leaked to the press. But the true crisis didn't break in the boardroom. It broke in the early hours of Friday morning in the private gardens of the estate. Madame Park had been walking among her peonies when the world simply tilted. The stress of the ultimatum, coupled with a lifelong habit of burying her weakness, finally demanded its toll. When Seok-Jin arrived, summoned by a panicked call from the head housekeeper, he found his mother in her bed, her face a pale, fragile gray, her breathing shallow and ragged. The doctors spoke of a stress-induced cardiac event. A polite way of saying her heart was struggling to carry the weight of her own pride. Seok-Jin sat by her side, the dark tattoo on his neck hidden by a high collar, his expression a mask of agonizing conflict. He loved her, but he knew that as soon as she woke, the walls would go back up. He was a man trained to fight rivals and execute mergers, but he had no idea how to heal a spirit that was rotting from loneliness and tradition. It was Zara who arrived 2 hours later. She didn't wait for an invitation, and she didn't come with a tray. She walked into the sterile, quiet room with the same quiet power she used to command a chaotic restaurant floor. When Seok-Jin looked up, exhausted and lost, she didn't offer platitudes. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch a grounding wire for his mounting despair. She won't listen to me, Seok-Jin whispered, his voice cracking. Even like this, she sees me as an opponent. Then let me try, Zara said softly. I've spent years learning how to care for people who think they don't need it. When Madame Park finally opened her eyes, she didn't see her son. She saw the woman she had branded a gold digger. She tried to pull away, her hand trembling against the silk sheets, but Zara was quicker. She didn't move to embrace her. Instead, she reached for a bowl of warm water and a cloth. With a focused, rhythmic grace, Zara began to bathe the older woman's hands, her movements slow and incredibly respectful. You should leave, Madame Park rasped, though the strength was gone from her voice. I am a waitress, madam, Zara replied, not looking up, her voice a steady, soothing melody. My job is to see what people are hungry for, and right now you are starving for someone to tell you that you don't have to be a statue anymore. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to let your son be happy. For 30 minutes, Zara stayed. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply provided the care that the house's paid staff was too afraid to give, and that Seok-Jin was too close to offer. She shared stories of her own mother's resilience in Lagos, speaking of how true power wasn't in the gold one held, but in the hands that stayed when the gold was gone. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the room, the tension in Madame Park's frame finally began to dissolve. She looked at Zara, really looked at her, and saw not a servant, but a woman of immense, unshakable character. In the silence of the sick room, the gold digger label withered away, replaced by the realization that this was the only person who had looked at the feared matriarch and seen a human being in need of rest. The recovery of Madame Park was not just a healing of the heart, but a dismantling of an era. As the weeks passed, the rigid atmosphere of the Seok-Jin estate began to exhale, the heavy silence replaced by the soft, rhythmic sounds of a house that was finally learning to breathe. The cold marble hallways no longer felt like a mausoleum of tradition. They felt like the foundation of something new. Madame Park spent her days in the garden, often accompanied by Zara, who taught her that a garden flourished best when it was tended with patience rather than force. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged skyline of Seoul, Madame Park asked Seok-Jin and Zara to join her in the tea room, the same room where she had once tried to erase Zara's existence with a single look. This time, there was no slate-gray hanbok or icy stare. She wore a soft, cream-colored silk, and her hands, though still thin, were steady as she poured the tea. "I spent my life believing that our name was a shield," Madame Park began, her voice quiet but resonant. "I thought that if I kept the world out, I could keep our legacy safe, but I was wrong." She looked at Zara, her gaze no longer clinical, but deeply appreciative. "I saw a gold digger because I was looking through the lens of my own fear. What I found instead was a woman who possesses the one thing I couldn't buy for my son, a character that does not break under the weight of a crown." She reached across the table, placing her hand over Zara. "I am sorry, Zara, not just for the words I said, but for the time I wasted trying to protect a fortune that is worthless without the heart to guide it. You are not a waitress entering our world. You are the grace our world was starving for." Seok-Jin felt the last of the tension leave his shoulders, the dark tattoo on his neck finally a mark of history rather than a signal of war. He looked at Zara, whose bright, expressive eyes were shimmering with unshed tears, her warm smile returning in its full, radiant glory. The wedding was held not in a sterile ballroom, but in the private courtyard of the estate, under the boughs of ancient trees that had seen 5 generations of Seok-Jins. There were no cameras, no rival CEOs, and no political allies, only the people who truly mattered. Zara walked down the stone path in a gown that combined the intricate embroidery of her Nigerian heritage with the minimalist elegance of Seoul. When she reached Seok-Jin, he didn't look at her with the cold focus of a boss. He looked at her with the reverence of a man who had finally come home. As they exchanged vows, uniting 2 worlds that the Society of Seoul said should never touch, Madame Park watched from the front row, a genuine smile reflecting her son. The feared Korean Mafia boss had indeed rejected every woman the world had chosen for him, but in choosing the woman who had first served him with a smile, he had secured a legacy far greater than any conglomerate. They stood together, the king and his new queen, ready to lead not through fear or fortune, but through the quiet, unshakable power of a love that had seen the man beneath the suit.